Good morning. Welcome to the Midpoint. I welcome you on behalf of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Thanks for joining us. The Midpoint is a webinar series through which we aim to bring interesting perspectives to the South African public and worldwide. The Midpoint series is unique in that it does not end with an online discussion, but it is always accompanied by a book or an article on the respective webinar topic. I wish to quote Dan Mafora. He says, "Courts have become targets for populist attacks, chief among them being the central role that they play in South Africa's constitutional democracy as the final arbiter and guarantors of the Constitution." Close quote. By now, you have heard or read the infamous article by Minister Lindiwe Sisulu titled, "Hi Mzansi, Have We Seen Justice?" It was published in January this year. The title itself shows that she intended to appeal to the masses, greeting in common township lingo to show that I'm one of you. And of course, this greeting resonates with the majority of people in our society. In the article, Minister Sisulu criticizes the Constitution and the judiciary as a whole. Unfortunately, she's not the first or the only one in a leadership position in our country to attack the judiciary. There are other leaders like her who appeal to people's emotions by using populist rhetoric, to name but a few. The Honorable Gwede Mantashe. He once accused the Constitutional Court justices of being an element of the counter-revolutionary forces, seeking the destruction of President Jacob Zuma and the ANC. Then Jacob Zuma followed suit. He compared judges to the apartheid rulers. As they are leaders in society, their harsh criticism of judges may create an element of mistrust of the judiciary. EFF leader, the popular Julius Malema, also criticized the judiciary, claiming that some of the country's judges were captured in favor of President Cyril Ramaphosa and a faction of the ANC. Though it is disheartening when leaders openly attack the judiciary, it is also testament to the independence of our judiciary. Despite the criticism they face, they continue to do their work without fear or favor, like we witnessed with the shocking revelations at the Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture, commonly known as the Zondo Commission. Today, we are joined by Dan Mafora, who will present his paper, In the Throes of the People, the Populist Challenge to South African Courts. The paper will be shared as the discussions continue, and it will also be available for download on the Midpoint and the CAS homepage. He's joined by Chelsea Ramsden and Sfiso Nxumalo, who will be moderating the discussions. I would now like to introduce Sfiso. Sfiso Nxumalo is reading for a Doctor of Philosophy in Law at the Faculty of Law at Oxford University. He holds a Bachelor of Civil Laws from the University of Oxford and a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Witwatersrand. He's the president of the Oxford Law Black Alumni Network and a graduate research resident at the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights. He's also a research assistant at the University of Oxford. Previously, Sfiso served as a law clerk to Justice Sisi Kampepe and Stephen Majid at the Constitutional Law and was a candidate attorney at Bowman's. I now hand over to Sfiso.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can see me. I'm having a few technological problems, so I do apologize for that. But as I've been introduced, my name is Sfiso Nxumalo, and I will not bore you with introducing myself again after that great introduction. But safe to say that we are here today to discuss, and I'm really privileged to be part of this conversation, to discuss Dan Mafora's latest paper, which is entitled In the Throes of We the People, the challenge to the populist challenge to South African courts. And it's really an interesting paper that touches on a lot of points. So, for instance, it also attempts to deal with the question of who are we the people, and what does democracy entail? What does majority mean? And also, what are the effects of these attacks on the Constitution, and the Constitutional Court and its legitimacy. But without wasting anyone's time and really hopping on something that Dan will articulate in a much more better fashion than I will, and you'll have the privilege of looking at Dan's gorgeous face. I will introduce Dan and also Chelsea, although I don't believe that they need any introductions. But I'll start with Dan. Dan Mafora is a research officer at CASAC, and he's also currently doing his LLM at the University of Cape Town, where he's also a assistant researcher and lecturer. And I know that he's there tearing down Gandla because that judgment has to go down at some point and be overturned. And he did his undergraduate at the University of Pretoria, and he also clerked for Justice Madlanga at the Constitutional Court. Chelsea is a senior legal researcher at the Helen Suzman Foundation, and she holds a LLM and a LLB from the University of Johannesburg, and she also recently did her LLM at the University College Dublin. And I hope I haven't missed out anything because my computer has malfunctioned, so I'm doing this off my head. But I hope I haven't missed anything, and please do let me know if I did. But without further ado, Dan, please take us through your paper.
Thank you so much, Sfiso. I am now going to share my presentation, or a brief presentation that I prepared for this. All right, I hope everyone can see that. Cool. Thank you. So when I was first asked to, or when I was first commissioned for this paper, I was excited by the prospect of doing research in this area. Firstly, because there is, I think, South African scholarship in this area is still in its infancy, right? So there isn't a lot out there on populism that is written specifically about South Africa, but even more so the relationship between populism and constitutionalism. Now, how I think of this is that, you know, at some level of the scholarship that I've seen, it seems that populism hasn't gained attention, or hasn't grabbed attention as an object of study or a subject worth studying in South Africa, simply because it is seen as countervailing the ANC's shift to the right in terms of economic policy. And we have seen, and as I discuss later, you will see that at each turn that the ANC kind of shifts to the right, embracing privatization, embracing austerity, we see the emergence of a populist leader who styles themselves as a left-wing populist leader, who then kind of ascends to power. And this has happened, at least in an account offered by Professor Tienes Roux, at least 2 times since 1994. So this paper doesn't seek to cover the whole ground, and it couldn't possibly do that. What I do here is simply sketch out some of the things that I think we should start looking towards as we begin grappling with this idea of populism as a form of politics, and as a form of politics that is not only compatible with constitutionalism, but often reliant and dependent on it for its survival and its entrenchment in the political system. So, what is populism? Now, when you read the work that's been done that tries to define populism, what it ends up as is a descriptive account of how to identify populism. So there isn't one definition of populism that is kind of a one size fits all, where when you see certain things, certain features of a political system, a political community, you are able to identify that community as espousing a populist politics, right? But across the scholarship, what we see are certain features that are prominent, that point towards a society being entrenched in, or a party or a leader being entrenched in populism or espousing populist ideals, right? So the first thing and the most important thing is the populists claim the moral claim as being the true representative of the people. Now, this is an idea that's central to populist thinking, that there is this greater ideal, this higher norm of the people as a unified, as a whole, as a homogeneous group that is morally pure, and that the populist leader seeks to serve, right? And so, or that the populist leader claims to represent. So what usually happens when this claim is made is that it is usually contrasted with an elite or other elites, or more than one elite, that is considered immoral, that is considered corrupt, that is considered aloof or out of touch with the people, and from whom the people must take back their power. Now, I'll talk about this a bit more later, but of course, it reinforces itself in very different ways, through the use of imagery and rhetoric, to the adoption of policy, right? All of it being premised on the idea of the people, okay? And then the second feature is that in the populist imagination, majority rule is viewed as the essence of democracy. It is seen as what democracy actually means, right? Whereas in liberal democracy, as we know it, majority rule simply means it's a rule of a majority, right? So it's a procedural aspect of how decisions are made in a democracy. It doesn't necessarily mean that whatever the majority decides will always be democratic, or will always espouse democratic norms and values. And so majorities take a central place as well in this claim that the people must govern, and the people are assumed to be not only a majority but the permanent majority in society. And the third thing is populists view the law as an instrument of power, an instrument of for entrenching themselves and their rule in society. Whereas in liberal democracies, what we usually see is the view of the law as a constraint on like raw political power, right? The fact that you have rules that apply generally to everyone, and courts are required to treat people equally, regardless of who they are or what position they hold in society. The populist views the law as a means of achieving their ends always. And so what happens is that if the law does not reflect what the populist sees as the will of the people, then it becomes an obstacle for the ascendance into power, the entrenchment into power, and it becomes necessary to get rid of it. And then the next thing is that populists are often said to be anti-institutionalist, right? So they often are mischaracterized as people who have no faith in institutions, people who would rather use protest or other forms of engagement other than institutions, or rather than using institutions. Now, there is a political theorist, Nadia Urbinati, who argues something different, which is that populists are not necessarily anti-institutional. What they are is pro-institutional for their own sake, and so they rely on the use of established democratic institutions and procedures in order to ascend to power, right? In order to accumulate for themselves power that they wouldn't be able to get otherwise, because often what happens is populist parties in society, or at least in liberal democracies in the West and now in the global South, happen to be in the minority. They happen to be minority parties, opposition parties, and such. And so the use or the cooptation of institutions for the purpose of achieving populist ends becomes important here. And the last thing is that populists have a kind of skepticism about the existence of law as neutral and impartial, and the existence of the rule of law as a non-political value that transcends politics, right? So the idea here is everything is political, everything is politics, and therefore it must be subjected to the will of the people. The people must control the courts, the people must control every other institution in society, every other democratic institution in society, because truly there isn't a distinction between politics proper and the law itself as this impartial or neutral, at least notionally neutral ideal that seeks to regulate the relationships of power in society. Now, as I said, just to elaborate further on these I think 5 or 6 features of populism, the moral claim as representative of the people relies on this idea of the people that exists out of what we know in society, right? The fact that a populist party does not have a majority of voters voting for it at an election doesn't really matter, because all it does is reinforce the idea that the people somewhere out there is an elite that is trying to repress the true people, the people proper, and not giving them a voice. So as you will see from that second point, it cannot be displaced. It's a moral claim that cannot be displaced by empirical reality, right? When you claim to represent the people and yet you keep on losing elections because people do not believe in your ideas or people are uncomfortable with your populist stance, you simply state over and over and over that it is all one big conspiracy trying to repress the views of the real people that exists, this ideal of the people that exists high up in your mind. Now, I've already touched on majority rule, but I want to just highlight this idea of instrumentalism, especially as it relates to institutions, is that when populists do not achieve their goals or cannot achieve their goals through these institutions that are established and entrenched as democratic means of decision making, they see that as a reason to destroy them, because institutions in their mind must always serve or must always reflect rather, the view of the people, must always reflect the will of the people. Now, of course, this will of the people is only known by the populists themselves, because they say that they are the embodiment of the will of the people. And so populism is itself, which is something that I thought was interesting, is it's not in itself irreconcilable with constitutionalism, right? It's not in itself irreconcilable with democracy as we know it, because ultimately democracies depend on majority rule, right? And that's the principle that underlies it. But it's a different form. It's almost a distortion of what it means to be a democracy, because power that is that could be vested in a populist leader through electoral processes is then gathered or accumulated through the use and leveraging of democratic institutions for means that they were not originally meant to serve. Now, the danger or the difficulty is that populist rhetoric is a form of legitimate speech, right? It's a form of legitimate speech, and while at the same time kind of like breeding mistrust of institutions, it functions within those same institutions to entrench an idea or a way of doing politics, a way of doing politics that does not necessarily reflect what the people in a democratic society, their values and their idea of what a democracy should be. So what does this mean for the South African context? Now, as I said, Professor Tienes Roux of the University of New South Wales has written an interesting chapter called Constitutionalism and Populism in South Africa. And he identifies certain things about our political moment and why South Africa is ripe for populist politics. So we know the material conditions of South Africans are quite dire. We know that we have high unemployment and inequality. We know that even if you are employed, you struggle to get by. You're living paycheck to paycheck. We know that there's a poor provision of public services, which means you have to go procure services in the private sector. We know that we are a very violent society, both at an interpersonal and at a state level. And so he identifies two phases of South African populism and how it comes about. So the first phase is the political struggle or the internal ANC struggle for power between Mbeki and Zuma in the mid 2000s. That where Mbeki was said to have been aloof, to be arrogant, to be out of touch with the people, and accused of staffing, of appointing to these institutions of power, institutions, democratic institutions, people who were like him, right? So the idea was that you have bred this new elite that is completely out of touch with the people, and that culminates in the election of Zuma as president. And in the second phase and also, sorry, in the Mbeki years, the issue was also that he had increasingly been adopting, conservative economic policies that were not really doing anything to improve the lives of South Africans. And the second phase of South African populism arrives with the emergence of the EFF as an alternative to the ANC. So the EFF identifies itself with the working class, the workers, the people, the marginalized, right? And then it makes a claim to being part of the Black radical tradition, which was for a long time, even though it was contested between the PAC and the ANC, that was what the ANC had itself claimed. And of course, we also know that they advocate for policies such as nationalization of land and industries such as mining and stuff, and an expropriation without compensation. Now, what effect this has had is that the ANC has itself started shifting towards a left populism in response to the electoral threat that's posed by the EFF. So we see the emergence of the so-called radical economic transformation faction of the ANC, which has kind of advocated for policies that are more or less the same as the EFF, and has adopted the same kind of the kind of posturing that the ANC has done. And we have also seen the results of that with the adoption at the last conference of policies such as the nationalization of the Reserve Bank and expropriation without compensation. So the EFF, even without a large electoral base, has been able to shift the ANC, towards a left populist orientation through the use of rhetoric and imagery. So what are the causes of populism in South Africa? The first is that the Constitution sets itself up for a very, very aspirational task, right? For a very huge task of ensuring that people have access to water, to healthcare, to housing. These socioeconomic rights, as well as rights to dignity and equality, impose very onerous obligations on the state. And the ANC-led governments have failed to live up to these expectations, to make them a reality. But what Professor Roux argues is that these do not only reflect badly on the ANC, but they also reflect badly on the Constitution as an aspirational document. It reflects on the Constitution as having failed on its promises, and of course, then the Constitution becomes the target for populist attacks. The reason why we're not progressing is because of this Constitution. The reason why you're still in a shack 30 years after democracy is because of this Constitution. We have seen political leaders just throwing their hands up and saying there's nothing we can do, the courts are going to strike down, and so forth and so on. So I'm aware that I'm running out of time now, but the role of the courts here becomes important, because ultimately they are the ones who have to decide the meaning of the Constitution and to act as its guardian. So they occupy a central place in our democracy, and also recently play a very outsized role in public life. During the Zuma years, we saw more and more focus shifting to reporting on the courts and their activities than we did in the earlier years of our democracy. Now, we have seen with this kind of increased focus on the courts that political leaders have become more comfortable with making attacks or launching attacks on the courts. For example, President Zuma has accused judges of taking more powers from themselves, has warned of a judicial dictatorship, and has openly called for the replacement of constitutional democracy with parliamentary sovereignty, because he views courts and judges as obstacles to the achievement of whatever political goal that he has in mind. So the issue is not that the Constitution or permits or allows for the flourishing of human life in South Africa, but instead that it inhibits such flourishing. The EFF itself has kind of jumped on that wagon, especially after President Cyril Ramaphosa took office, accusing judges of being in his pockets, of being paid. As mentioned earlier, Lindiwe Sisulu as well has gone out, called judges mentally colonized. Premier Zikalala of KZN has called for a return to parliamentary sovereignty as well, saying judges were standing in the way of economic transformation. And of course, they are both expected to run for office at the ANC's elective conference. And of course, these are opportunistic attacks on the courts because they want to appeal to that more populist faction in the ANC. Of course, none of these claims are true. We know from the vast body of jurisprudence that comes out of the early 2000s that it was often courts who were making socioeconomic rights claims concrete. Think about the TAC case in relation to ARVs. Think about Grootboom in relation to housing. And by the way, Ms. Grootboom died without a house years later. Think about COSA, about around the provision of social security. And so even though we know objectively that this is not true, the claim is not meant to be empirical. It's this idea that the people exist even beyond our own reality as we live in South Africa, and that courts themselves occupy the space or are actors against whom the people must rally. Okay.
Sorry, Dan, just oh, perfect.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm almost done. Yes. So we have also seen, unfortunately, that populist rhetoric has kind of seeped into the courts. We have kind of seen a change in the kind of language that judges use when they dissent. I don't want to go too deep into that, but I picked up an interesting data point last year, Afrobarometer's survey on institutional on South Africans' confidence in institutions showed that only 43% of South Africans, or the respondents, said that they trusted the courts. Now, of course, you don't want to draw anything from that, but the Zuma debacle of last year, I think, might have had something to do with that. And quite concerning was that people who are poor or lived below the poverty line trusted the courts much less than people who were what we would consider middle class. And so that in itself is a concern. Yeah, so I'm going to stop there and I'll leave the slide up just so we can pick it up from there. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much, Dan. That was very interesting. As someone who fundamentally believes that there's something epistemically wrong with the Constitution itself, and I also believe that the court is somewhat to blame for some of these populist comments or attacks that come to it based on some of its poorly reasoned decisions. But I'm looking forward to engaging with you on those points later on. Chelsea, would you please offer some responses to some of Dan's provocations?
Thanks, guys. Hi, I was introduced earlier. I'm Chelsea. So I just wanted to start off by congratulating Dan. It is a well-written piece and it is becoming increasingly relevant. I think it's something which should form the basis of more and more discussions to come. As Dan mentioned in his presentation now, the studies in South Africa are still in their infancy, but his paper is intended to provide an overview and context of populism in South Africa and the courts. However, Dan has done wonders in explaining the concept of populism, as well as explaining how the will of people is situated within that concept. So with this in mind, I'm going to talk to Dan's paper generally and with reference to the courts more specifically. So in preparing for this paper and after reading Dan's paper, I found it worth noting that South Africa is not unique in facing this populist uprising and its related tactics. Rather, there is a global rise of popular rhetoric now. So this allows for an interesting comparative in how populist movements have been able to influence their various domestic courts and what tactics they employed in doing so, as well as the responses of those courts. So I'll allude to some of those examples as I progress in the discussion. Populism presents a singularly dangerous threat to the independence and credibility of the judiciary. And without this credibility and legitimacy, the courts will not be able to function effectively and efficiently as demanded by our Constitution. A defining feature, or more specifically, the first step of South African populism is the use of public remarks that criticize or attack the courts, the judges, the Constitution, and the rule of law. So Dan's two examples of populist movements are those of Jacob Zuma and Julius Malema. Both have been extremely outspoken in their criticisms of the judiciary, and in the case of Jacob Zuma, it goes so far as to ignore court orders. Both do so in the claim that the courts are not working for the people, but rather for the so-called elite. When it comes to public remarks, politicians have the upper hand. Judges are meant to speak exclusively through their judgments, and therefore when they are publicly criticized, it's hard for them to defend themselves. Yes, there are examples when the judiciary speaks up, and specifically through the Chief Justice, but this hasn't happened many times, or there haven't been many examples of it in considering how many years of criticism there have been against the judiciary. The fact that this is bolstered by the fact that our constitutional democracy, which is meant to be premised on a balance of powers between the three arms of government, has, to put it nicely, not functioned optimally for years. The failures of the executive and the legislature to implement real changes to socio-economic circumstances of the lives of the majority of South Africans, the rampant corruption and self-serving tendencies of many involved in those institutions, means the courts have had to play an increasingly active role in keeping checks on the powers of the other two branches. The increasing use of the courts to settle the political scores has opened up much of the criticism, and along the lines of that it's overreaching its powers, that it's descending into the political arena, and that it's deciding on things that it should not be deciding on. Globally, the second step of populism is to implement more extreme measures to influence the courts. This includes by either stacking or packing the courts with more compliant judges, or even making constitutional amendments which impacts on the independence of the judiciary by changing their jurisdiction or interfering with their terms, their tenure, their selections, their discipline, all that stuff. At this point in time, South Africa is slowly moving from step 1 to step 2. As noted by Dan, the antics of Julius Malema and like-minded commissioners at the Judicial Service Commission interviews has seen him influence in some manner the appointments of judges, and this can be a very dangerous precedent to be setting. Thankfully, our democratic institutions have not yet allowed populists to dictate any legal amendments that would interfere with judicial independence, but this is not to say it won't happen. Dan also mentions that there is discussion surrounding combining the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal, and this should and can already be seen as a move in a direction. So I agree with Dan. Populist movements are not necessarily anti-courts or institutions and establishments. It is only when the courts are not working in their favor that the so-called hidden agenda to frustrate the will of the people comes out. Ironically, Zuma and Malema have both utilized the court processes when they want something out of it. Think Zuma in his latest corruption trial, or now even with the public protector in a latest application to rescind an order refusing to listen to a rescission application. The lengths they go to utilize these court processes and yet publicly criticize those very same processes goes to show that populist leaders follow their own interests, which can change on a whim. Globally, the courts have reacted differently to populist movements. The US Supreme Court appears to be bending to the will of public opinion, one would believe the leak opinion of Justice Alito in the Dobbs versus Jackson with abortion, or the Israeli Supreme Court, which recently ruled that it domestically is not bound by customary international law. Poland's judiciary was recently restructured after a populist movement there. There's a couple of others, like there's Venezuela, Hungary, it's happening around there. But at the moment, the same cannot be said of South Africa. The courts are very aware of the populist rhetoric that's going around, but they are yet to succumb fully to any form of real pressure from it. Our Constitution, being supreme, implores the courts to interpret law within its spirit, and this means that our judges use core values, which allows them to consider the fundamental values and principles that are shared by all in our society that shape their decisions rather than basing them on the decisions of one populist or a few populists for that matter. Paradoxically, the populist rhetoric then uses these decisions as example of how the courts are anti the people. For example, the recent decision of the Constitutional Court in Tubukele. The fact that constitutional damages were not awarded was made to seem anti-people, but very little attention was paid to the fact that it was the government's failure for providing housing for so many years that led to the court case in the first place. So therefore, by playing on these very real socio-economic concerns and problems of the majority of the public, the populists managed to shift the blame to the courts and paint them in the bad light in order to avoid their own responsibilities. What then should be done? As Dan suggests, an important step is monitoring the JSC proceedings and ensuring that they remain accountable. This would help us going a long way in ensuring we don't step into the second step any further. Recently, this has been a topic of much discussion in the news. The role of overseeing has been taken up by civil society in the absence of any real concern shown by political power. I know that's the same with KSAP, with HSF, and a few other organizations as well have mentioned things. The second thing that Dan mentions is the need to educate the public on the functioning and processes of the court. This is 100% correct, but it's not that simple. Without the cooperation of the other arms of government who are constitutionally obliged to uphold, respect, promote the Constitution, which includes the judiciary, little can be achieved in terms of education. So I'll actually end it off on that note and just hope that by bringing in more on the end of what can be done and what should be done, that it will enhance further discussions that will prove fruitful in coming towards an effective solution. I know that wasn't the point of Dan's paper as well, but I do think that that's something that should come from it and should stem from it.
Sorry. I was muted there. I wasn't saying anything intelligent, so don't worry. I was merely just saying that if you have any questions, please send them through. We would be very grateful for them. And thank you for your response, Chelsea, which is also very thought-provoking, particularly when you highlight the global trends of what's going on in other countries and why we should be worried about populist rhetoric being on the rise. So Dan, I just want to ask a question. So what avenue should people take in the event that they feel that certain decisions by the Constitutional Court are hindering progress? So let's, for instance, take the case of Tubakale, which I think Chelsea mentioned, where the court, in my view, incorrectly said that constitutional damages cannot be given to socioeconomic rights. What would be the appropriate sort of mechanism for that if you are, for instance, the EFF and you think that something should have been done?
Right. Well, I think Chelsea quite rightly pointed out that, firstly, constitutional damages are still a very complex and contested idea in constitutional law, and we don't have settled law on that, right? So that's the one problem. But the other problem is, as Chelsea also highlighted, that for this case to come ultimately to the Constitutional Court, there had been a failure for so long, for over, I think, a decade, if I'm not mistaken, to provide housing to these communities. And of course, there was always the danger, or there was always the risk that the court would rule against the applicant's claim for constitutional damages. But laying the blame solely at the feet of the court, right, absolves the actual actors who were meant to provide housing, who were meant to ensure that these people had accommodation. It lets them off the hook. Because then all they can do is just like throw their hands up and say, well, the court said you are not entitled, therefore you're not entitled. But we only get to that point because they had failed in the first place. And so the focus actually shifts away from the people who are responsible ultimately to provide the access to these rights. And then through litigation, shift that blame onto the courts when the result is not favorable. And so, yeah, that's the one thing that I would say. Yeah.
And with that said, so I think you're absolutely right. So with Tubakali, I think it was about 20 years. So it's more than the decade that you spoke of. So you're absolutely right. Okay. But now what is when I have, what do we do with decisions like the Zuma case, right? Because I think you've been quite vocal with the fact that in the Zuma 1 matter, and you write about this in your paper, for instance, even though you don't fully explore that argument, but you say that, the Zuma 1 matter, the Zuma 2 and the Zuma 3 cases sort of all led to this, uproar against the courts. And I'm curious as to whether or not you don't think that the court in one way or the other is also implicit in some of these populist rhetoric emerging. So if you look at the Zuma 1 case, the court there, in my view, didn't have jurisdiction. I don't think it had jurisdiction to hear the case as to whether or not Zuma should be forced to appear before the Zondo Commission. That's the Jafta matter. And then secondly, you then have the dissent written by Justice Tharon in the Zuma 2 case, where she not only says that the majority judgment is bad in law, but it's unconstitutional. It's, a grave injustice, effectively. But the language that she used there was what fueled the third application, the rescission application. Zuma's lawyers were quite clear in using her own judgment. And also, even if we go beyond that, let's go back to the secret ballot case, where the court, through Justice Mogoeng's, or Chief Justice Mogoeng's dissent, said that this was a constitutional case of, a textbook case of judicial overreach. So a member of the court, a senior member of the court, recognizes that the court has overstepped its bounds. Surely that then, in some way or the other, fuels these ideas of there being a super branch of the Constitutional Court, which has, powers to do certain things that it wants to do, and sometimes it's not even constrained by text, as we've seen. I'm just thinking out loud.
So I definitely think there's issues of law, right, about some of the reasoning in these cases, and I think that there has been, like I said, a shift in the kind of language, the tone and temperament of dissents in the Constitutional Court. I think it was unfortunate that kind of language, I think, as you said, Chief Justice Mogoeng first accused the majority of being of acting unconstitutionally in the impeachment case, and that has now come back, right? That's a thing that now judges can say to each other. And I say towards the end of my paper that will also be something that needs to be worked on, that judges internally need to start tempering the way in which they write their judgments and how they present disagreements amongst themselves to the public. I think that it did open up an opportunity for populists to jump on that idea and to run with it, right? And we saw also the lionizing of judges like Justice Jafta and Justice Tharon, which in itself is concerning because, judges are not meant to be celebrities, meant to be celebrated in the kinds of ways that we have now seen. And I think you have a point to say there's some blame to be laid at the feet of the courts for how they conduct themselves in some matters. I don't want to put it higher than that, just because also it is a complicated subject in itself. But I think primarily the issues also that the disputes that we're seeing about the courts, about their roles in society, have very little to do with the law. They speak to larger questions of policy, of politics, of value in society. And I think judges should be careful not to have themselves drawn into that. And I am a little bit concerned about now this tendency that seems to be coming from the Office of the Chief Justice, where he will have regular media interaction and subject himself to questions about the court's functionings and things like that, engaging with journalists at a very at a level that he should not be engaging with. I think that also has the potential to kind of fuel these attacks, or this idea of judges just being politicians in robes.
Sure. So I've got a few interesting questions that I'll field. Chelsea, please jump in if you have anything to sort of add. So one question comes from Nomfundo, and the question is there a difference between what some would call a black radical critique of rights and the courts on the one hand, and then a populist challenge to the courts on the other hand, or do you see these as being one and the same? I'm not sure if you may want to unpack that.
Sure. So my understanding, if I'm understanding Nomfundo correctly, there is a tradition in South African legal scholarship that challenges the very notion of rights, or the idea of rights as enshrined in the Constitution. They're informed largely by a view of history, by the idea that the Constitution is a preservation of conquest and colonialism that started in 1652. And I think that's a more substantive critique than what we see here as the populist challenge to courts. So, like I said, there isn't really a unified theory, ideology that informs these attacks. It is, in the case of ANC politicians, is their desire to shift the blame to someone else. It is their desire to depict themselves as victims of overreaching courts, or courts that hinder and meddle in the business of governing. And in the case of other populist leaders like Malema, is to actively breed like resentment, constantly going out and saying these judges are, in the pocket of Ramaphosa or in the pocket of whoever. They will never rule for you as people. It doesn't matter, blah, 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 blah. And then to turn around and then use those very same courts, right, to try avoid any kind of accountability for the things that he has done as a person in society. And so they're quite cynical in that way. I don't think that populism, at least in the context that I've discussed, it can be equated to this idea, the radical black tradition that really looks at the emergence of rights and situates it in a more, I guess, historical, or views it through a historical lens that is informed by work that is being done about the dominance of Western thought in new democracies and things like that. So that's the difference that I would choose, or that I would highlight there.
Sure. So I must confess that I probably roughly fall under the black radical critique. I think I'm someone who believes in the Constitution being a site of epistemic injustice, and, as you said, a reconfiguration really of racism and all these other issues that were not really solved in 1994. But that's just a side note. Another question is that is the recent populist challenge to the courts really out of the ordinary? So this is based on the idea that this is just a product of sort of the counter-majoritarian dilemma that exists in many sort of countries that have judicial review. So, if maybe you're looking at your Jeremy Waldron's argument against judicial review, something similar to that, you have these unelected judges who have the power to strike down laws and so forth, particularly when constitutions always start out with "we the people." So that's the idea.
Right. So I think Chelsea made a very good point, which I wanted to make earlier about developments in Eastern Europe. Right. The ascendance of these what were right-wing fringe groups at the time to being populist right-wing parties in government. Right. Shows that this is not just another instance of a manifestation of the counter-majoritarian dilemma. There are a lot of countries where there is judicial review, but the courts are not subject to the kinds of virulent attacks that we have seen in recent years. And they're relatively peaceful societies, relatively successful democracies. Here, the issue is that it is aimed at something more than just criticizing the idea that judges have this power to strike down legislation, strike down conduct, but that they are ultimately illegitimate, that the power that they hold cannot be justified, that it should be subject to control of the people. And as Chelsea said, you look at Poland, where the speaker of parliament literally said, if the law does not achieve a particular thing that we want, then we will break it. You look at how they either, when they come into power, they either pack the courts or completely take away the power of judicial review, right? And so it's I think, I mean, we've had the counter-majoritarian dilemma as everyone else who is a liberal democracy has had, but there's something alarming about what it means for attacks to take on what we have seen as a delegitimizing role. In the pursuit of power, in the pursuit of something more than just critique of the court's decisions. And you'll note often that there isn't any critique of the court's decisions, at least at a substantive level, right? It's always just these people are the actual obstacles to achieving what you want, never making the argument that actually, we could still achieve this because the Constitution empowers us to do so. So I think I'll end on that note.
Okay. Chelsea, do you have any final remarks, maybe?
Yeah, to be honest, the reason I haven't jumped in to say anything is I think Dan has adequately explained and answered everything that, especially in the last question, that I would have said as well. So that's really just my...
Sure. No, thank you. So I think we are about to hit the time. So Dan, do you have any closing remarks, any points of reflection, and perhaps what direction do you think we should take as concerned citizens or as people who are interested in the constitutional enterprise?
Right. So I'd just like to thank everyone who took the time to come here today. Appreciate it. I hope you will download the paper, read it, and my email is on there, so feel free to send me your thoughts. I think that there is space for further research. Certainly, I think my paper probably just scratches the surface, and that there is a lot to be done. I think engaging publicly about our Constitution, the state of our democracy, the state of constitutionalism in this country, can only serve us well. And I am very thankful to Konrad Adenauer for the opportunity, and certainly look forward to taking this project up in future. And yeah, thank you so much.
With that said, thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to engage with you on further platforms and these events continue. And from our side, thank you and have a lovely weekend. Not weekend, it's still Thursday, right? Yeah, have a lovely week, whatever remaining week that you might have. Cheers, bye-bye.
Thank you.